Hey guys, welcome for another video. You are watching.
Hey guys, welcome back. So let's talk about MCP authentication and the authorization. The vulnerabilities with respect to authentication would be the generic because like if the MCP is configured with OAuth, the generic vulnerabilities with respect to OAuth would be applied here. Something like where there is if there is a weak validation on the redirect URI, possible of open redirect can be happen, or if there is a weak algorithm that has been realized, kind of JW related attacks could arise, right? So we don't have any in-depth topics or scenarios that we're gonna discuss here. I'm gonna keep it generic, standard to the OAuth, kind of refreshing the knowledge about the authorization. The possible scenario that can happen is where there is no authentication implemented on the MCP itself, right? There should not be a way. Or there are scenarios where the people just use a API key if application serves on API key, and they develop the tools top of APIs, and they serve the API itself as the authentication mechanism. That is also fine, but OAuth is some of the kind of standard way that even suggested from the MCP security best practices. And even in OAuth, we should ensure OAuth 2.1 that the Pixie method is the best method that we can implement. How the Pixie method works in the sense, let's show the OAuth flow. So client generates the code verifier and code channel challenge, and when the authorization call is generated, there will be a client ID and a code challenge, and the hash method used to generate the code verifier, and the user authenticates and the consent gets approved, and authorization server gives back the auth code. Now again the client will send the request for a token by sending the auth code and the code verifier which was generated at the initial stage. Once the code challenge verified against the code verifier, then server refresh the like sends the access token, and following that refresh token to ensure the client gets connected to the server, right? So this is how the generic Pixie or 2.1 flow works, and this is one of the strongest suggestion mechanism from the MCP security best practice perspective to be implemented. There are scenarios where people utilize some implicit grant or other methods, and they have some of the control mechanisms established on top of that, but still would definitely recommend to utilize Pixie because that is one of the best way to implement when you have a end devices or end clients as your that serves your authentication. If it is something like server to server communication, we could have relied on other methods, but when you have end clients where you have to serve your work, then Pixie is one of the method we should rely on. So the common attacks are the token pass through method, where token has been passed directly without verifying twice, like without having this Pixie method kind of thing, right? Like whether we don't know whether the right client is trying to invoke the token. It can be spoofed client, or the attacker service, or a client trying to call to the server and steal the token. Pixie as a dual way of verifying by code verifier and code challenge, where both gets verified with the initial handshake and the handshake where the token gets exchanged. That makes better security mechanism in the exchange of token. And session hijacking, this is very common thing. If at all, if you are having a web based uh, MCP client where you have your chat box, something like that, and if you are passing the session ID in a URL, that is not one of the suggestion mechanism to be implemented. That is insecure by design itself. We have to ensure that we do not send the session ID in the URL. And or confusion attack, that's what we discussed about, right? Like we should have the redirect URI validated against the clients that trying to connect to your server. We should not keep it open or too generous on that. There should be a proper validation on where we gonna redirect our code to. That's one of the important thing that we need to consider in the mind while we looking into the design review as well. If at all, if we are coming up with a new auth mechanism dedicated for MCP, and some of the common JWT related exploitations, right? Something like algorithm abuse or weak secrets related to generic JWT attacks and privilege escalation via tool injection. This is kind of authorization impact we can tell where tool itself, some other tool, let's take you have around like 3 to 4 MCP servers where one of the MCP server is malicious, and that malicious server try can invoke the your actual generic MCP server and make some abnormal call. And if you don't have any proper authorization checks to against such command execution or some file read or path traversal which we see earlier, that can even break down the authorization implementation and can let attacker to pull the files or execute some commands, and can even trigger some of the remote code execution as well or read any sensitive files as well. So some of the defense in depth that we can think about is ensure there is a 1.3 TLS implemented, certificate pinning, IP allow listing, and readers protection on the auth endpoint. And with respect to authentication, ensure you have implemented 2.1 auth and a pixie method, and definitely do not have a refresh token validity with unlimited expiry. Have some fixed uh, session timeout based on the business use case. Some business keeps for 48 hours, some for 72 hours. So based on the business use case or user timeout, where user being inactive for xyz minutes, right? So we can figure out based on the business needs. And authorization have proper access control and role based control, and ensure you have a principle of least privileged implemented, and ensure whenever you pass the client request to the server, there is a context aware access validation that is done on a server side, and ensure you have a proper validation against the session stored session id that server gets request from the client, and monitoring against the anomalies, something like trying to bypass the rate limit or trying to invoke the different sessions of different user ids, and failed attempts where trying to abuse different ids while you logged in different user. And on the response automatic lockout, ensure you have a proper token revocation mechanisms. And incident response is you should have a proper logging system to identify from which user id or from which auth application this particular event has triggered, something like that. We have some of the sample code, uh, how you can implement right. These are something like pseudo code that one can follow through. This is not like actual code. And we do have some of the MCP auth security checklist, like never accept tokens in URL, never pass through client tokens, and always validate JWT algorithm, implement session binding. This is important, and ensure you use 2.1 pixie method, sanitize all tools description, implement token rotation and GTI tracking, right? So these are some of the security checklists that one can keep in a mind. I even added some of these in my framework that I have developed, where you can check under. I think it is under transport layer. No, yeah, transport layer and authentication. Right, same thing. So, and some of related to session IDs. Yeah, so these are some of the basic things that we can keep in consider when we are trying to implement the OAuth 2.1 or OAuth implementation on the MCP. But exclusively, if at all, if your team is implementing OAuth 2.0 with any different grants like authorization code grant or implicit grant, please recommend them to implement pixie methodology, because that is one of the standard way by default whenever you're dealing with the end devices or a client kind of you know service distributions. All right. Okay. Uh, this is about the MCP authentication and authorization. So see you guys in the next video.